We're in Ezekiel, and we are by review primarily chapter 7 before we move on into chapter 8 today. But review is good to us, and Peter says it's necessary to bring back remembrance. So I think that we're justified in doing those things. Wickedness on the mountains was seen in chapter 6, and in the land in chapter 7, and in chapter 8 it was in Jerusalem. So we see God focusing Ezekiel's mind and vision upon these particular aspects of the whole of Israel, particularly to the land of Judah, which occupies Israel at this time of the writing of this book. So Ezekiel's prophecy is commanded by God against the mountains in chapter 6, followed by that against the land of Israel in chapter 7, reflected upon pagan worship that has now been enjoined by the Hebrews. God's intervention was to slay the worshipers and bring spiritual and physical idolatry to an end. Only a remnant, signifying the majority, had to be slain. Will remember God's claim that he had been hurt. That meant broken in the Hebrew by their adulterous hearts in verse 9 of chapter 6. Therefore he would inflict disaster on those left behind. Having pronounced this judgment, Ezekiel was to clap his hands and stamp his foot in response to God's righteous justice administered upon the very unrighteous worshipers. That pantomime, of course, was recognized by the people for what it meant. And recognition of God's stretched out hand is evidential to the sword, the plague, and the famine, as verse 12 defined it. God, through Nebuchadnezzar, would bring upon them at this time those things. And then as we moved into chapter 7, it said, the end. The end, the final goal, as the Hebrew word would have it, of God's focused wrath is visited upon the land of Israel by cleansing it, by bringing their errant ways to an end, started with removing the living remnant to Babylon. Repeatedly, God said, I will have no pity on you, verse 4 of chapter 7. Instead, disaster, verse 5. And as we look at that disaster, you will understand it as unique. And using that word, we need to turn our thoughts to it. The Hebrew says, terribly bad. Uniqueness means it's going to be terribly bad. Your evil according to your ways, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 7, those are evil ways. You will be repaid in kind, verses 9 and 10. Particularly verse 9. And thus symbolically, using Aaron's budded rod as their rod having grown into a rod of wickedness, quotes in quotes, in verse 11, showing forth a blossoming of sin of violence through arrogance, verses 10 and 11. God said he would repay in kind. This is almost that arm for an arm, tooth for a tooth type of representation of life that we've grown to accept throughout the annals of human history. And such foresees money and the economic system made useless when they try to avoid this tumult that is coming upon them. And we read about that in verse 7 in chapter 7, verse 7, verses 12 and 13. He even goes to say that the watchman on the wall has been made useless. Should the survivors escape, He will so do, that survivor will do so having deep conviction of sin, verse 16. Like a mourning dove, he finds himself mourning over his own iniquity. So the survivors have a heart of understanding that God is bringing his wrath fully upon them. And so like a rag doll, his strength is removed, it says. He's limp. He can only mourn his shame. He's shaven his head. He's dressed in sackcloth, and he's displaying that shame on his face. His physiognomy speaks volumes, for his head is bowed, and he's in shame. It is deeper, it is a despair like no other. Again, the word unique. With no earthly recourse, verse 19. It's terribly bad. They will watch foreigners plunder and profane their once sacred and sensuous lifestyle. They had changed their sacred ornaments, at verse 20, into detestable idols, only found valuable for pagan worship. And now they knew they were useless. Their lifestyle and earthly perversions had failed them, and so it concludes in verses 20 through 22. The physical chains that bind captives had morphed into spiritual chains, into, quotes, a city full of violence and full of bloody crimes. Verse 23. The army called out by God to judge Judah is in verse 24 the worst of the worst, bringing disaster upon disaster without relief, verses 24 to 26. They seek security from their godless leaders to no avail, verses 25 to 27. The puppet king Zedekiah is seen clothed with horror. Can you imagine it? Well, those who survived that were in exile couldn't believe it. God had never done these things. And so as we turn to chapter 8, and we look at chapter 8 through 11 as another block of information that comes to us about the vision that is given to Ezekiel. Why does God give such a profound vision if he's not trying to impress upon them and certainly upon us that follow the power of his holiness? Chapters 8 through 11 are a vision God gave Ezekiel on September the 17th, 592 BC. God gives Ezekiel spiritual eyes to see the wickedness in Jerusalem. It is 14 months after his first vision that was recorded in the first two verses of the beginning of the book.
Would you tell me that date again?
It's September the 17th, 592 BC. Now you remember Daniel's vision of how in the future of the 70 weeks, it was to the very week. You can go back and you can get the calendar and you can follow it, the progression of it, to the very almost day at which Jesus entered into Jerusalem to be crucified, as prophesied. So here another prophecy that has exacting time, chronological time for us to look at it. Chapter 8 reveals the wickedness in the temple. Chapter 9, the slaughter of Jerusalem's people. Chapter 10, the departing glory of God from the temple. And chapter 11 will deal with the judgment upon Judah's rulers. So he's getting very specific. He's bringing it right down to home. And so as we begin with chapter 8 today, We're looking at verse 1, and it reads this way. And it came about in the 6th year, on the 5th day of the 6th month. There's where you get your numbers. As I was sitting in my house with the elders of Judah sitting before me. Now, where's his house? It's in Tel Aviv, as it were, outside the big city of Babylon, in a smaller city called Tel Aviv. That the hand of the Lord God fell on me there. Jerusalem's doom was justly deserved, as we've already observed and studied. And Ezekiel is host to the elders. Now, he's confined to house arrest by God. You remember that. Ezekiel's not out wandering among the people. For the most part, he's not been able to speak. And until God opens his mouth, he does not speak. And so he pantomimes everything that goes on, because the people have not listened to God, and God said they will not listen to you. Therefore, I'm going to put a pantomime before them, because they're very much into play acting. They'll understand the pantomime. And when I open your mouth, you will be able to speak. But otherwise, you're confined to your house, Ezekiel. And you remember all the things he had to go through as he built this little city and put an iron wall, and he laid on his side and did all these things in front of them. Now it's down the trail. We're 14 months after the first visit of God to Ezekiel on the river Chebar outside of Tel Aviv. And so Ezekiel is host to the elders of Judah that are in exile in Tel Aviv, and it's in his house that this occurs. And the Jewish minds that were gathered there had drunk in the Kool-Aid of the false prophets, both in Jerusalem and Babylon. All that follows is in light and conformity to Jeremiah's previous instruction to the exiled. Here's a very important passage that comes out of Jeremiah. Understanding that Jeremiah is the elder, Ezekiel is the next in line in terms of age, and Daniel was the younger. But they were all gathered at this particular time interval of about a decade, when this war that was brought upon Israel and Jerusalem occurred. With a few exiles from the previous two invasions of Nebuchadnezzar into Israel, taking back the cream of the crop, if you might say, he drafted the best football players and took them back to Babylon. Now we have here a picture of what Jeremiah has to say in Jeremiah 29, 4-9, as he speaks in prophecy. And he said it this way: "Thus says the Lord God of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." So Jeremiah is addressing these same exiles that in Tel Aviv, that Ezekiel is among at this present time, okay? But here's what Jeremiah had to say to them. "Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and become the fathers of sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, and multiply there and do not decrease." So God's increasing the numbers of people of his while they're in exile over these 70 years. And he's increasing their numbers. And by Jeremiah's prophecy, the instruction came through Jeremiah. And seek the welfare. Now the word welfare means peace. Seek the peace of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its peace you will have peace. So we have a picture that Jeremiah is saying that this city where the exiles were gathered was a town of peace. Nebuchadnezzar was not fraught with destroying them. Those that were in captivity, he had captured as to make them Babylonian. He was at peace with them, and God was going to ensure their peace. But God was going to ensure a greater peace by building up Israel in exile. Okay? They still don't have a right mind, but he's going to produce more bodies. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets who are in your midst and your diviners deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams which they dream. So what is he warning this peaceful city about? He's warning them about their elders who are practicing false, godless prophecies before them, as did in the days of Elijah. We're looking at the same type of stuff going on here. Don't listen to these guys. Don't let these prophets, these false prophets and diviners that are grasping at straws, try to tell you about the future which they have not received any message from me about. It's concocted. It's spin. It's a false narrative. Don't follow it. For they prophesy falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. The timing is right, God's timing. We're not looking definitely at chronology here. We're looking also at the time which we call Kairos, the season of the time. The time is right, and God is speaking through Ezekiel. And he's saying to those who were in attendance, through Ezekiel, my hand is upon Ezekiel. And Ezekiel says, God's hand fell on me there. Another vision of God's plan. God's hands upon him. How does that vision play out? Let's look at it in verses 2 to 5. Then I looked, and behold, a likeness as the appearance of a man. From his loins and downward there was the appearance of fire, and from his loins and upward the appearance of brightness, like the appearance of glowing metal. And he stretched out the form of a hand and caught me by a lock on my head, grabbing his hair as he pleased. It must have grown back, for he had previously shaved it, remember? And the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven into the expanse, right? Remember that word, expanse? Lifted me up in the visions of God to Jerusalem. He took, though I was residing in physical form in my house, he lifted me up, as it were, and took my soul, spirit, if you please, to Jerusalem. Brought me the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the seat of the idol of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy, was located. And behold, the glory of the Lord God of Israel was there, like the appearance which I saw in the plain, looking back to the chapter 1. Then he said to me, Son of man, raise your eyes now toward the north. So I raised my eyes toward the north, and behold, to the north of the altar gate was this idol of jealousy at the entrance. Well, that's a long rendition, but I think you will find in it what and where God is taking, by his power, the eyes of Ezekiel to see and to report on. It's a recurring theophany that we're looking at here. He looks like a man, but he isn't a man. You notice his description. He couldn't describe him. He came in the form of a man, but I couldn't describe him. Look at him. The brightness of him, the glowing metal. That's what he looked like. Anyway. It's the theophany that we saw back in chapter 1, verse 27. And here it fills Ezekiel's vision in verses 2 and 4. And he sees himself lifted up and transported to Jerusalem, all the while he physically is in his house. And the Holy Spirit's work is imposed upon his mind. And now we begin to see what happens in the mind of Ezekiel as he sees what God takes him to see. And Ezekiel's vision is now focused on the north entrance leading to the inner court of the temple as viewed from its outer court. Now, if you go back and you understand it in the days of Jesus pretty well in the big temple, the temple that had been set up earlier by Solomon was very, very nice, but it was not to the extremes that Herod had built. But you had an outer court where gathered lots of things, even Gentiles. But the inner court was respected by Jews only, and it was illegal for anybody else to enter, right? And within the inner court sat the temple. So there was a wall of partition. We call it the middle wall of partition in Jesus' day. You remember those names. And so Ezekiel's vision is now focused on the north entrance leading to the inner court of the temple as viewed from the outer court. There his eyes fell upon a pagan idol, an idol of jealousy that affronts God. Full-blown syncretic worship. What do I mean by syncretic worship?
Double or two.
It's a marriage of two. It's taking the pagan marriage of their gods into the marriage with God, the true God, and trying to put them together and making them equal. Are we having problems with that in this society? I think so, and in this world for certain. Since other prophets had accused Israel's false worship as likened to a religious prostitution, you remember Hosea was a total chapter, a total book about this. God says, my bride has gone off and made a harlot of herself, but I'm not forsaken her. She's left me. You remember that story. But you also, for example, in 2 Kings 21, read about Manasseh seducing Israel with Asherah. Who's that? That's the Canaanite goddess whose name echoes to Ishtar, who was the beginning fertility goddess that came out of Babylon in the third generation of Nimrod. Ishtar has been on the face of this earth from that time after the flood until the day of mid-tribulation when the Antichrist deposes of her. So she comes by different names: Athena, Aphrodite. I mean, you just find it all the way through. You find it in the Egyptian goddesses, you find it in the Canaanite, and in the Canaanite goddess Asherah, the female equivalent to Ishtar, if you please. She was the goddess of fertility, very likely again seen in the vision of this day that is before Ezekiel. And thus he sees the idolatrous abomination. Ezekiel had the glory of God standing beside him, advising him on where to focus to see. He said, look north, look right there at that idol. I want you to see it. Take note of it. It's the idol of jealousy. And it roused God's indignation because that's where he was fiercely wrathful and what he was standing first of all the things that Ezekiel was to see this day. This was the first one he was to note. And so as you look at verse 6, you hear these words. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations which the house of Israel are committing here? That I should be far from my sanctuary, yet you will see still greater abominations.
I I think it's amazing that the Jewish people put idols in the temple.
Well, it gets worse than you think.
Yeah, I know, but that just,
It gets
how
awful.
how could they have done that? I just,
Have we not put idols in
well,
many
that's
of our
what
churches?
yeah, and that's what I'm thinking, that maybe we're doing things that are just as detestable.
I'm afraid that's often true. God touched Ezekiel's spiritual conscience, asking, quotes, "Do you see what they are doing?" As quickening his conscience to Isaiah's words that had been spoken a century and a half before in Isaiah 42:8. Quotes from Isaiah, "I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images." That's God speaking through Isaiah. And God is saying to Ezekiel this same message. And he's saying to him in this verse, my presence needs to be removed from here. God is saying to Ezekiel, I'm going to remove my presence from here. Then God provoked Ezekiel's mind that he will, quotes, yet see still greater abominations. How much greater can the abominations get? Well, today we'll get through 4 of them. Verses 7 to 13, another long section here that comes together in this context. Then he brought me to the entrance of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. And he said to me, Son of man, now dig through the wall. So I dug through the wall, and behold, an entrance. And he said to me, Go in and see the wicked abominations that are committed there, or they are committing there. So he's taken through a hole in that wall of partition, to see what's going on behind the scenes. The idol of jealousy standing on its outside is beginning to, in Ezekiel's focused vision, bring horror to his mind of what's going on. And God is saying, I'm going to show you something worse. And he said to me, Go in and see the wicked abominations that they are committing here. So I entered and looked, and behold, every form of creeping things and beasts and detestable things, with all the idols of the house of Israel, were carved on the wall around. And standing in front of them were 70 elders of the house of Israel, with Jazaniah, the son of Shaphan, standing among them, each man with his censer in his hand, and the fragrance of the cloud of incense rising. Then he said to me, Son of man, do you see what the elders of the house of Israel are committing in the dark, each man in the room of his carved images? For they say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. And he said to me, Yet you will see still greater abominations which they are committing. Well, this is a pile of them right here. And so he's transported by God to the very wall of separation to see a hole in it. And Ezekiel was instructed to dig through it and enter the exposed inner court. Go in and see the wicked abominations they are committing here, quotes in quotes. And he says, Behold, which is a startling, this is necessary that you see it and understand it. Behold, a pantheon of idols. What do I mean by that? Every idol of every descriptive kind you can think of, along with carved displays in the wall that were despicable. And I can guarantee you they were sensuous. Unclean things, as verse 10 would say. Presiding in ceremonial fashion were 70 elders. 70 elders were seen here of the house of Israel, as God had formerly advised Moses to appoint, holding censers, burning with incense, as if connecting with God. Okay, verse 11. But no, verse 12, you're supposed to see, and the word in the Hebrew says, see into the dark. Each man is doing this. Each one is doing this in his own private room, in the room of his carved images. In the development of the millennial temple, there'll be a big description about how these people who serve in the temple have a room to themselves where they kept their cloaks and where they kept their writings and they did their things. It was their little private room, right attached to the wall, as it were, the inner wall. And here it's talking about the individuals of these 70, each one of them having his little room with his own little idols that were hidden in the dark that nobody else had admission to but he. That's the inference that I see in this verse. Now, historically, they had already experienced, these people, that is the people of Jerusalem and the people of Israel, the two invasions by Babylon, and now a third was coming down upon them, and it was going to be a devastating war, unlike the first two. The first two led to captivity and some looting. This one is going to burn you down type of war when this siege is laid. And of course, this had already been prophesied by pantomime by Ezekiel to these people who were sitting in his house. I mean, they'd already seen this. But now comes to Ezekiel, his vision, and he's reporting on it. And he's reporting about these 70 elders. We're going to see them immediately again in another abomination. But they have individually little rooms where all their idols are sequestered. Among the greater idols that have been carved into the walls and the sensuous, despicable things that were all around. Can you imagine the desecration? Verses 14 and 15. Then he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. And he said to me, do you see this, Son of Man? Yet you will see still greater abominations than these. So here's the third. A third vision. And it reveals Jewish women gathered at the north gate, verse 5, worshiping this idol of jealousy, with emotion, weeping for Tammuz. Capture that. Hang on to that name. Tammuz was the husband of the goddess Ishtar, said to have been killed by a wild boar and cast into the depths of the earth. His residence in the underworld would be interrupted in the minds of the pagans each spring, as he would be, by their godless imaginations, said to emerge to give land life-giving rain. Fertility worship was therefore enjoined with his arrival and was practiced to encourage his return every year for a period of 7 days, at which time the Israelites would gather, and they would gather before this worship center. And the many prostitutes would gather on the high ridges where everybody could watch prostitution in action to bring forth fertility upon the land. Syncretic worship. And at the same time, to appease the gods, throw their babies on the arms of the brazen altars and burn them. That's what's been going on in Israel. Now, The month of the Hebrew calendar, June and July, is named Tammuz, even to this day. Again, God said, quotes, still greater abominations to come. So, verse 16. Then he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the entrance to the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, understand that the inner court is elevated from the outer court. Steps leading up to it, through a chamber of walls, which we're talking about here in terms of the words of the entrance to the temple, between the porch and the altar. The porch, as you know, a porch, the first landing up, and then a little bit of a tunnel, and then it enter into the inner court, where the altar was the first thing you saw, the bronze altar. This is the holy place, not the Holy of Holies. This is the holy place. And there were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they were prostrating themselves toward the sun. Oh my goodness. What's going on here? This evolution of evil is like leaven. And God proclaims this is a very serious abomination. It is no light thing, he said. The Hebrew word could be used as trivial. This is no trivial thing. And it's seen revealed in escalation from the first through the fourth visions. From the first through the fourth, we're now at the third. Sin's reward nationally, Judah now in view, of course, was that they had filled the land with violence, quotes and quotes, worshiping idols which often turned to human sacrifice. And God therefore says rightly, quotes, they have provoked me repeatedly. I missed verse 16. Sorry, I must go back and hit that because you won't understand 17 and 18. Oh, my mind doesn't always follow on track. Let me read verse 16 again, and then let me explain it. Then he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, the entrance to the temple of the Lord between the porch and the altar were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they were prostrating themselves toward the sun. Okay, we must understand this vision sees the holy place where the sacrificial altar was placed, an entry there from the east so that true worship faced the priests westward. So the priest should be turned westward, looking at the bronze. You're coming in from the east. These 25 should be looking at the bronze altar, and therefore they would be looking westward as you're coming in from the east, okay? That's the way it should be. They are there to give, quotes, true worship, as it were, in their service as a mediator for God, begging God's forgiveness for the sins of the people. That's what it was all about. But instead, these appointed priest mediators had turned what? Their backs to the bronze altar. They turned their backs to the temple with their faces to the east. It's like they had gone in by backing into it. Worshiping what? The sun. It's right there in that verse. They had disowned the holy God of Israel. And now verses 17 and 18. And he said to me, do you see this, Son of Man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Israel to commit the abominations which they have committed here, that they have filled the land with violence and provoked me repeatedly? For behold, they are putting the twig to their nose Therefore I indeed shall deal in my wrath. My eye will have no pity, nor will I spare. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet I shall not listen to them. Okay, back to 17 and 18. The evolution of evil was like leaven, and God proclaims this as a serious thing, no light thing, no trivial thing here in this escalation of evil. Sin's reward nationally, as we speak to Judah in particular, was that they had to fill the land with violence. I mean, this is, what are we doing today? In these last 4 years, we've been trying to fill this land with violence and call it a just and righteous violence as we burn down cities and steal and rob and kill.
That's democracy.
That's democracy, yeah. The people are speaking rightly, right? And they were worshiping idols, and that often turned to human sacrifice. And therefore God says rightly, they have provoked me repeatedly. Then God said something that you can't quite interpret, but yet you can. So let me interpret it as you think you are rightly doing so. God said, they were willfully thumbing their nose at me. You've heard that expression. That's what you should understand. They're putting a twig to their nose. Okay? That's how we would understand it. As if to create a stench in God's nose? As willful, offensive act, purposely done? Verse 17. Therefore, verse 18, I, God, will deal with them without pity, and will not hear as to listen to their cries for mercy. They've earned their just reward. It's coming. And when we turn to chapter 9, Ezekiel's vision of the slaughter in Jerusalem, it invades our presence and understanding. It's brief and it has a chapter. It's not terribly long. But the prophet Jeremiah was eyewitness to it, saw it fulfilled from his side as he had to flee and was taken to Egypt. But as we look at this next week, we're going to see the hand of God as the true executioner of Jerusalem's inhabitants using his proxy. Iran is not the first one to have proxies. Nebuchadnezzar is the Babylonian proxy used by God because he's the most vicious of all the vicious of Gentile nations in the eyes of the Israelites in this day. No one greater to come down upon them and to execute righteous judgment upon a defiled worship center and a people and a city. It'll be interesting to note that the inhabitants that were spared at this time were given a mark on their foreheads. The ones that were spared were given the mark on their foreheads. The Antichrist is 180 degrees turned around from God. He puts marks on the foreheads of those who are going to be slaughtered. You really have to ponder those things. There's nothing new on planet Earth. Things that we read about and think were first instituted were oftentimes previewed in previous time. And this is one of those types and antitypes again. They keep springing up, showing us that these kinds of things have history to them. And God gives revelation to the people when he first starts the prophecies of a little bit of what it's like, amplifies the prophecies later, gives more information, and then finalizes the end with the greatest of the prophecies, which of course will be the tribulation prophecies in Revelation and Daniel and other books. Are you beginning to capture the flow of what's going on? Why must we see how God, in his loving kindness, must execute justice? And what did he command to us? Did he not say, "O man, what is required of thee? Do justice,
Walk.
love mercy,
Walk humbly.
and walk humbly with your God." He's playing that whole issue out here. He's going to turn this terrible stuff into a blessing of those who are at rest and peace, who will be brought back from Babylon. And that'll be the beginning of the dry bones coming back in. There's just lots of things that go on in time that we just can't equate with, because our time is not eternal time in our minds. And so these people are saying to God, "I'm going to turn my back on you because you haven't answered what we want you to answer to. God, you're not doing it our way, so we're going to turn our backs on you. We're going to thumb our nose at you." He says, "Sorry. Judgment shall come. I will do justice." I will have no mercy when I do justice, but I will do mercy because of my love and my long-suffering patience upon those that I have chosen to separate from this mayhem. But those that practice these things, and particularly the elders and the rulers that were so provoking God, it was nasty. Can you imagine your king having his eyeballs ripped out with a spoon?